All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name's Caroline Murphy. I'm the Government Relations Manager at the Wildlife Society. I am joined here today with Drew Winters, the Policy Director at the American Fisheries Society, as well as Cameron Anderson, the Policy Intern at the American Fisheries Society. So we are going to be going over the recent reintroduction of the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, talk about what the legislation looks like right now, next steps for legislative engagement, and kind of the roadmap for what we're looking to do in this Congress. Just a couple of housekeeping items. So we will have time for questions at the end. You can either put your questions in the chat function or the Q&A function, and Cameron will compile those and we'll start rolling through those at the end of the presentation. We also will be recording this webinar, as well as sending along PDF copies of the slides. So if you do see throughout the presentation, there are links to various resources. Do not worry about scribbling down the URL for those resources. We will be providing those in PDF form. Okay. There we go. Okay, so overview for today's presentation, we're going to walk through the new legislative text of the recently reintroduced House bill, talk about accomplishments over the past Congress, the previous Congress, the 116th, talk about who else is supporting this legislation very briefly, and how we as professional members of a professional association fit into that. And then talk about steps moving forward, what the legislative outlook is going to look like for this Congress. Okay. Yes, Drew, I have it recorded. Don't worry.
Great. Awesome. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, no worries. Yes, so we are recording this as stated previously. So if there is anyone else within your unit that you think would be interested in it, or if you want to share with all unit membership, we will have that resource available to you. So just getting through the rest of the overview, looking at legislative outlook going forward, as well as how you as professionals can plug in. Okay, so this is the Recovering America's Wildlife Act of the 117th Congress. So it was reintroduced a couple weeks ago. It has a bill number of HR 2773. Just for reference, the bill text is not yet on congress.gov, but it will be within the next few days. And you can do a deeper dive into the bill text if you would like. This bill is very similar to the legislation that passed out of the House Natural Resources Committee in the last Congress. The goal of the bill, just as a refresher for folks that are new to this, it's to provide dedicated funding to states, territories, and tribal fish and wildlife agencies to do proactive conservation work with the goal of keeping common species common, as well as keeping species from getting to the point of requiring listing under the Endangered Species Act. So presently, proactive conservation at the state, tribal, and territorial level is done through implementation of wildlife action plans. So wildlife action plans are these conservation action blueprints that describe with adequate resources what sort of projects and improvements would occur towards species conservation efforts over the next 5 years. So these are updated at least every 5 years. So that is what we're looking at fully implementing, full implementation of these state wildlife action plans. And on the tribal side as well, providing resources for the creation of these planning documents and associated conservation measures. So the funding associated with full implementation of these plans, it's going to be $1.3 billion annually towards state and territories conservation efforts, and $97.5 million annually towards tribal funding efforts. These funds, these would be general treasury funds. They would be allotted to states and territories, that $1.3 billion chunk, based on a formula. So the formula is 50% based on the land and water area of the state, 25% based on the human population of the state, and 25% based on the proportion of species listed under the Endangered Species Act within that state. In previous versions of the bill, there was that 25% portion of listed species that used to be only 25% of listed vertebrate and invertebrate species, but it was expanded out to all species with the intent of including plants within that overall formula. So there are additional carve-outs and considerations for plant conservation efforts within the newest version of this bill that is probably the biggest change between last Congress and this Congress. So we have within the $1.3 billion, we have a carve out for a competitive innovation grants program, and that is the same this year. A new carve out is to provide states and territories that include plant species conservation, an additional incentive to improve upon and implement those plant conservation efforts. So for states that do include plant species conservation within their wildlife action plans, they have the ability to get an additional 5% of funds on top of their already apportioned funds. I've hit very hard on state wildlife action plan implementation within the current version of this bill, but as in previous versions of the bill, it does include flexibility in funding for states. So states do have the ability to work on law enforcement, conservation, education, and enrichment activities, on the ground management activities, invasive species management and control, as long as there is that connection to listed species of greatest conservation need within those activities. And so I very briefly went over all the current iteration of this legislation, but this link does provide the summary of changes to the new bill text does provide a more in-depth look at that for your reference. Okay, so now I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Drew.
Awesome. Hi, y'all. So we're going to talk a little bit about the great successes we had in the last Congress. So we are so proud of the work that TWS and AFS units across both societies did. So we had support from over 50 units in doing things like writing letters of support from chapters, signing on to big letters that were circulated by the National Wildlife Federation, doing in-person visits, a number of different ways that our societies were engaged in this. And this is really key to do this Congress and expanding upon this and building more stakeholders as we go. So for the future of the bill in this Congress. So last Congress, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act made it through House Natural Resources Committee. That's the committee of jurisdiction on this bill, with a vote of 26-6. That was amazing. That led to the full bill being passed out of the House as a 5-year authorization, not dedicated funding as we had hoped, but it was a great start, at up to $1.4 billion per year as part of HR 2, which was the infrastructure bill in last Congress. So as you might remember, an infrastructure bill has not yet passed Congress, and we're working on another one this Congress. So be thinking about that as we move into positioning the bill in this Congress. So last year, the House bill had 185 co-sponsors. That is a tremendous amount of support, and it really allowed us to get through the committee level with the vote that we got, with that 26-6 vote. And so one of the challenges we had last Congress was that there was no Senate companion bill introduced. So that's going to be a key hurdle for us to get through this year. We had such a coordinated movement with so much support across conservation organizations, our professional societies, AFWA, just a great, broad, diverse group working to support this legislation. And that's what we're going to need in this Congress as well. So we'll be thinking about where we go from here. Next slide, please. All right, Caroline.
Yes, thanks, Drew. So we have this great bill. What do we do now? Who are the stakeholders that really care about this legislation? So Drew got into this a little bit, but to expand upon this, these very broad big buckets detailed in this slide, these are the sorts of entities that we interact with towards passage of this legislation. So sports persons, conservation entities, We care about this legislation because we know that proactive conservation funding works. We have an understanding of that based on Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson excise tax dollars, state and tribal wildlife grants programming, which is currently the only funding mechanism for implementation of state wildlife action plans, but it is chronically underfunded and does not meet the need for the diversity of species that states, territories, and tribes are responsible for within their jurisdictions. So that's really where we come to the table, sportsmen's and conservation entities. As far as private business goes, so I'll expand this a little more to industry more broadly. It is good for business if there is less regulation impacting wildlife species. So proactive voluntary conservation efforts done at the state and regional level provide for more flexibility as opposed to listing under the Endangered Species Act. So that is what we are looking to avoid with implementation of this bill, cut down and reduce the number of species that need Endangered Species Act listing, have come to that point of needing those emergency room measures. So we as AFS and TWS interact with these entities, but what do we bring to the table? What is our slice of the pie? Why do we care about this legislation? And before I do move on, I do want to touch on, there are more detailed resources on other stakeholders that are interested in this legislation and associated talking points when interacting with them. So this talking points link just has a suite of different stakeholder groups and mechanisms for engaging with them. And then this organization letter in support, this is a great tool for figuring out what other entities in your state or region have stated support for the legislation. So there's over 1,000 entities listed on this letter of support, which is still open for sign on if your unit has not yet signed on. And it gives you an idea of, oh, okay, this is the diversity of entities that have been engaged with to date on this legislation. So you guys, as natural resource professionals, why do you matter to this overall process? Well, number one, you as an individual are a constituent of a member of Congress, and that is hugely influential on its own. So Drew and myself, we can obviously work to advocate on behalf of you in Washington, D.C., on behalf of professionals, but we are not constituent level groups. We do not have a very intimate understanding of what is going on with the natural resources within that member of Congress's district. And that is hugely important. So you as the expert, the wildlife professional, the fisheries professional, you have a much more fine-tuned understanding of the resource-related challenges impacting your congressional district. Even if you don't have what you assume to be like the wonky talk and vernacular of interactions on the federal policy level, it doesn't really matter. What members of Congress care about most is their constituent base and what their constituent base cares about. And they also really love stories and anecdotes. So if you have any great stories, anecdotes, data that members of Congress and their staff can utilize in support of this legislation, or more broadly, building out a relationship with that office so they have an understanding of who the experts are, who the professionals are within their region, that is also hugely influential. So that's you as an individual member. Expanding this out to organization units. So maybe you as an individual professional do not feel comfortable stating a case to your congressional office, whether that is due to work-related pressures or really anything else. That is where your professional society comes in. So you have the ability to influence what your unit puts out into the world, the positioning of your unit, the outreach of your unit, and it does not need to be assigned to your name or your person. That is the cover that professional society engagement is able to provide. So I am gonna go ahead and pass it back over to you, Drew, on next steps.
Great, thanks. So HR 2773 has now been filed in the House. As I mentioned before, there was no Senate companion bill last Congress. And as of yet, there is not a Senate companion bill in this Congress, but one is in the works and we are hopeful. It's going to be really interesting to see how this bill progresses in this Congress and how it moves. There are two different pathways. So the regular path would be for the bill to go through committee, pass the House, then have Senate passage, you conference together the bills if you have different versions and send it to the president for approval. Or it could be included in a broader package like an infrastructure bill, like the House bill was last Congress. This is probably the more likely scenario, but either way, whichever path this bill progresses, we're going to need a high co-sponsor count. And that's where your help is really important to help us get additional co-sponsors. So there are a number of different ways that we could do that, that you can get engaged. Next slide, please. Is that me? Yeah, that's me. Okay, so there are a number of ways for you to get involved, either as a unit, a chapter, a section of our respective societies, or as individual members. And we're happy to work with you individually on some of this, but we want to cover some of the opportunities for engagement today, just so you can put your thinking caps on these. So again, as we mentioned, we want more co-sponsors, right? We want your member of Congress to say, I support this bill, I am a co-sponsor of this bill. And the way to go about doing that is to do a letter of support from your chapter. We've got drafts that you can adapt for your use. AFS has a Google Drive where we've collected some of the ones we've done for past Congresses. We also have a sample form letter. And we can help you insert the relevant information into your letter and get you the names of the staffers for your members of Congress and transmit those letters for you. I mean, that's how we do it at AFS. Caroline may do it a little bit differently for TWS, but we're happy to work with you. Those letters allow us an opportunity to get in the door and talk to those staffers and those members of Congress on your behalf. So they're very, very important. There's also an opportunity to sign on to these group sign-on letters, like the NWF sign-on letter that was circulated last Congress. There's an opportunity to still get on. We're still using that letter. So those are two really, really important ways that you can engage at the unit level. And it allows you to not have your name on anything individually if you don't want to do it. You do not even have to put your name as a chapter president or chapter leadership. It can simply say from the Montana chapter of the American Fisheries Society, or from the Florida chapter of the Wildlife Society, or whatever your respective chapters are called, right? You don't have to put Joe Q Fisheries Professional on the signature line. All right, other ways you can get involved. So the more people who are advocating on behalf of the bill, either to their members of Congress or within the broader community, and that means talking about the bill, increasing support from other conservation organizations or other businesses, bait shops, tackle shops, ammo shops, right? The people who will benefit from this robust fish and wildlife populations and less ESA regulation, right? You're going to be targeting those. So the more people who know about it, the more people who are supporting the bill, the better chances we have of getting this bill through Congress. And so sharing fact sheets, using the toolkit, posting on social media, sharing the webinar recordings, using your chapter's communications tools to reach out to your members so that those who are comfortable advocating can do so. So we've got a toolkit link here on these slides for you to look at. We're happy to do some unit education as well. So if you've got, a meeting coming up and you need us to give a little spiel on the Recovering America's Wildlife Act to your members, if you want us to put a blurb in your newsletter, come to us, talk to us about that. We will help you educate your unit members on this. And then it's really, really important to work in partnership with other conservation groups and stakeholders who are working on the bill. So again, look to that NWF letter, see who else in your state is supporting the bill and figure out how you can work with them. Sometimes it's helping a member of Congress tour a project, right? Being involved in a site visit. Sometimes it's just providing the stories or some support to the other conservation groups that are working on this. And you can explore various ways that you can support the bill with them if you're not comfortable on the front lines of advocacy. And then turning to individual member engagement, if you are comfortable picking up the phone and calling your member of Congress, You can go click this link, you can insert your zip code, it'll tell you who your member of Congress is if you don't already know. Then you can use our call script and call your member of Congress. The offices log these calls that they get in support of the bill, right? You can say, hey, I'm Drew Winters, I'm policy director for AFS, right? I'm in Maryland, Jamie Raskin is my member of Congress. Please co-sponsor this bill, right? So you've got a script right there lined up for you. Or you can send an email to your member of Congress using TWS's Action Center. Both AFS and TWS members can use TWS's Action Center to email your member of Congress and ask them to support the bill. So that's lots of different ways that you can get involved either at the unit level or the individual level. All right, Caroline, next slide.
Can you see the next slide?
Yes, I can. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Great. All right. So we have done a grassroots training before where we've talked about making an elevator speech, making a pitch for support of this bill. So you can use this model that we're going to be talking about for the next minute or so, either if you have like a chance meeting with a staffer from a member of Congress or to other organizations that you want to get involved in the bill, right? Right, we go back to normal in real life when we're back out in public and talking to people and visiting. You have a minute to sort of talk to somebody about why you think this bill is great and get them on board, right? So in less than a minute, how can you give a concise, memorable, personal appeal for support to other stakeholders or again, that member of Congress? So introduce yourself, right? You're just a regular person talking to another person. Provide some essential facts about the bill, what it does, why you support it, who else supports or opposes it, and ask them to support it. So, you know, if it were me and I was out in my neighborhood and right, so we're really focused on climate change right now. And so what I'd say is, hey, I'm Drew Winters. You know, I work in conservation policy and I'm really excited about this bill. It's the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. It's an opportunity to keep species from getting on the endangered species list, right? For fish, you know, my husband's a big fisherman. He loves to go fishing. And did you know that 40% of all freshwater species are imperiled from a range of things, habitat loss, loss of connectivity, right? Like dams and other things that impede fish passage and pollution in our waterways. This bill helps to address some of those things and helps fish to get in better shape in the face of all of these climate stressors. I would love to see the state of Maryland have more support for this bill, right, for this, right, to ensure the health of our fisheries populations. So I would love you as the, you know, the chapter of Garden Club of America to support this as well. Did you know that it also supports butterflies and pollinators and all the things we need for healthy habitat for all of these other animals, right? So we'd love for you to work with us in support of the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. So that's basically it. It's not very eloquent today, but we can show you some videos if you're interested in learning more about this. We'll put some resources up with some past videos of some ones that are a little bit more elegant than the one that I just gave you on the fly.
Drew, I thought that was great. So I'm gonna take it back over. We're just gonna talk about very quickly about upcoming initiatives and what you as members and units should be prepared for and thinking about going forward. So big one, virtual fly-ins. So we, alongside other conservation partners at the national level, are figuring out timing for a virtual fly-in event. What a virtual fly-in is, when back in pre-COVID times, many organizations would, including the Wildlife Society, employed use of fly-ins. So we would bring constituent level expert members into DC to talk with their members of Congress about the importance of whatever the issue is. So the issue being here, funding for at-risk species conservation at the state, territorial, and tribal levels. So that is one tool on the grassroots level that we will be employing, honestly made much easier by the fact that congressional staff are still largely operating in the virtual sphere and are very open to these virtual meetings. Another one, Senate introduction. So as we previously talked about, we're looking at companion legislation for the Senate bill. We do not have that yet. We're still looking at potential champions on the Senate side, but when that does occur, we will let members know about it, and it will be a very similar push, trying to get as many members of the Senate on to show as much support as possible for the legislation. And then the next one, we will again probably be utilizing community sign-on letters in this Congress, particularly when we get to junctions for the bill. So when we have a House Natural Resources Committee markup, or it gets on the floor of the House, or it's pending adoption within an infrastructure package. Those are the times where we really want to show as broad support across the United States as possible for this legislation. So that is a tool we will likely be utilizing again. With that, that wraps the presentation portion of this webinar, but we would be happy to take any questions. So I'm going to pass it over to Cameron. If you do have a question and you haven't inputted it yet, please feel free to put it in the Q&A or the chat function.
Yeah, so far we have a question from Patrick Chi. He wants to know, how do you know if your representative is a co-sponsor yet or not?
Yeah, great question. So on congress.gov, you can look up HR 2773. That's the number for the legislation. And you can look at a list of co-sponsors within the bill. It's very easy to look up. We do have congress.gov linked on this presentation, so you can very easily find it once we send along these PDFs. One other item I did want to note, as Drew was stating earlier, AFS has form letters and can help you get those letters out the door. We at TWS can and will do that as well for you. So just let us know, keep us updated. And if you do send correspondence, just give Drew and myself a heads up, because it's great for the member office to hear from constituents, but it's also a really great for us in DC to follow up and say, hey, we would be super interested in following up with you on this constituent level request, and keep each other updated on those next steps with those offices.
Yeah, and we have another question from Joseph Roy about the wording in the bill in terms of it saying to amend the Pittman-Robertson Act. And he just wants to know where the funding is coming from. Yeah,
so the pot of money it's going into is a previously established fund. It's I'm gonna botch it, but it's like the Wildlife Recovery and Conservation Fund under Pittman-Robertson that was established in the early 2000s, but was never really funded. So that mechanism for funding exists, but the actual funding itself comes from general treasury funding. So for folks that have been engaged in this for a long time, they know that previously it was directly tied to offshore and onshore oil and natural gas extraction royalties, which is part of the general treasury, but a very specific part of the general treasury. So this just opens it up for available funding sources.
And then Allison Fowler has two questions. One about potential Senate leads for the Senate bill, and then two about when updated state apportionment amounts will be released.
Okay. Drew, do you want to take either of those?
So I'll take the apportionment one. If that is not ready yet, it should be ready very, very soon, because I believe I saw an email come through with updated apportionments, at least, right? Like some update on that. So I think that's due pretty soon. Caroline, is that how you understand it?
Yeah, right now it's my understanding that Fish and Wildlife Service and the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies have that draft apportionment document, but they are verifying it with state agencies right now. So it should be out very soon. I apologize. Oh, Senate leads, that was the other question. Great question. We know that Senator Heinrich of New Mexico is a huge champion of the legislation, very interested in being a Democratic lead on the bill. We want to make this bill bipartisan though. So I am not as in tune and directly interacting on potential Republican Senate leads right now, but I know that a few other organizations have been shopping this out. And it's not gonna be a go ideally until we get that bipartisan lead.
Yeah, that's all the questions we have for now.
Okay. Any other questions? You can also, our emails are listed on this slide. You can please feel free to reach out to either or both of us, and we'd be happy to field additional questions. Anything else, Cameron, or?
Nope, not right now.
Okay.
I'd love to leave us with this. Just let us be a resource to you. We are happy to answer any questions, guide you through this. Again, our chapter support helps us get in the door. It helps us support the bill more, right? So it's a symbiotic relationship. And, you know, this bill, when it is realized, I'm going to be positive, right? When we achieve success in getting this bill passed through Congress, this is really going to benefit fish and wildlife professionals, right? It means the resources to do in your state, in your agencies, in your organizations, the good work that you have been doing all along, just more and appropriate resources to do the work that you all do so well. So it is a win-win-win for fish and wildlife professionals. It also gives funding, right? It's not just going to go to state agencies. Those funds will be passed out to other conservation organizations who do on the ground work, to folks like aquariums. So be thinking about those who would benefit from this, both in terms of reduced regulation, the businesses that are supported by robust fish and wildlife economies, other natural resource professionals and organizations that you work with, right? Look, this bill is a long shot, but it takes a long time to get a major conservation bill passed. But with robust support, we can make it a reality. I mean, it took what, 20, 30 years to get the Land and Water Conservation Fund permanently authorized, right? It's a major conservation bill. It's the opportunity for this generation, right? And so the more people who are working towards it, the better chance we have of success. But it really will take all of us and many, many organizations, partners, businesses to help move this through. So we just encourage you to do everything you can and that you're comfortable with to help move this along.
Yeah, and we also got a few in the meantime. I think it was. So one question from Christopher Ayers is, how do we know if our unit is already a sponsor or has sent a form letter in?
So if your unit has already sent a form letter in the previous Congress, it is a really good idea to dust that off again and do another hit this Congress with updated information, updated bill number, and ensure that you keep it top of mind for your congressional delegation. As far as understanding if your unit has already previously done that, I'll speak specific to TWS. So we have our policy library on wildlife.org where you can look up all unit correspondence. You can also, we do have a Dropbox folder. So AFS has a Google Drive. We have a Dropbox folder of resources that we have received from units. And I will make sure, I think it was linked to in the previous email I sent, but I will make sure that is linked to as well for reference for folks so they can see any correspondence their units previously sent.
Yeah, we also have one from Kimberly Titus about any upsides or downsides to having various state wildlife society and AFS chapters operate independently with their members of Congress.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start this and then transfer over to you, Drew. We interact with this on all sorts of policy issues. So at TWS, we have the Conservation Affairs Network, which is a communications tool to coordinate between chapters, state chapters, regional sections, and headquarters. So that is a useful tool in ensuring consistency of messaging. And that's what we at headquarters really want to provide the resources to ensure that we are speaking with one voice, and we also have relevant information that is tailored to that member of Congress. So perhaps there are upsides or downsides in not speaking like as one uniform association, but I don't know. I would say generally I very much enjoy my interactions with different units and their different thoughts and ideas on how to best collaborate. And it's very useful for me to get an understanding of the resource related needs within their unit. So I think it really provides strengths more than anything. Drew, do you have anything to add?
I mean, I think, you know, like we have a question here that says, we don't typically work with AFS, it's the TWS chapter. I mean, that's okay. I don't think it's a Herculean effort, right? Somebody could send me an email and say, who's the chapter president in Alaska? And I can give you their email address and you can reach out to them. And if it's easy, good. But if it stops you from working on the bill, please don't let it stop you, right? You don't have to work in concert. Caroline and I work really closely together. We will go to the Hill together to do these meetings. We do joint press releases. We obviously do joint webinars. There's a great synergy at the national level. If it works for your chapter, great. If it doesn't, that's okay. We just want you all working on the bill. So whatever is easiest and best for you all, it's awesome, right? I don't think, you know, Don Young is going to be like, well, we didn't hear from AFS on this, so we're not going to support it. I mean, I don't think that matters really, but you know, to the extent you can, great. Let us help you and make it easy for you.
And then we have another question from Patrick Chi about how much does the U.S. currently spend on conservation, and how much would RAWA potentially increase it?
Oh, that's a great question. So the natural resource and environment section of the entire federal budget of all discretionary funding, it's right around 1% right now. There are already pretty significant investments in conservation in the US, particularly on the private land side of things. So like Farm Bill, Title II implementation, though those are mandatory dollars. I am saying all this to state that I don't have a clear answer, and it also very much depends, I would say, on what you qualify as conservation funding. When we look at more specifically towards the implementation of these state wildlife action plans, the direct funding mechanism at the federal level is the State and Tribal Wildlife Grants Program, which is funded at about $70 million annually. Does not come close to meeting the needs identified within plans. But it does show that if we are able to do investments, states can do, 1 to 2 good conservation projects a year on those existing funds. And the big problem with state and tribal wildlife grants on the state side and the tribal side is that it's not dedicated funding. So there's not certainty in funding. And that's particularly an issue with tribes who only have competitive grant dollars to draw from within the State and Tribal Wildlife Grants Program. So they don't have the certainty of funding every year. And that makes it really, really challenging to do long-term conservation planning. Anything to add on that, Drew?
Nope, I think you covered it. I mean, the conservation needs of this country are great. And there are many, many programs that support, federal programs that support conservation type projects. But it's very clear that the need is much greater, and the need is greater, particularly in light of climate change. So I guess the only other thing that I might make a plug for is that we are doing a briefing on Capitol Hill on climate. It's not Recovering America's Wildlife Act, but we will be talking about it on Thursday, about how funding for some conservation programs can help fish and wildlife become more resilient in the face of all these climate stressors and do great things in terms of sequestering carbon and supporting clean drinking water and reducing flooding and all of these things we're facing in light of climate change. And we are going to be putting in a plug for Recovering America's Wildlife Act. So if you would like to send your member of Congress a note to come and see this briefing, I would be happy to send you the invitation. If you want to help us plug it, we would love that.
Yeah, and we can include that in the follow-up resources. Okay, well, I would say we have time for one more question if we have any additional ones.
We do. We actually have 2. Maybe we can answer them both quickly.
Okay.
One is from Jim Ramaka, and is AFWA as involved in the recovering efforts as much as the professional agencies and NGOs?
Yeah, I mean, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies is very involved, and I would say essential in this effort. So Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, alongside National Wildlife Federation and Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, are on the national level, like the legislative leads interacting on state agency conservation and sporting issues to kind of create more of this diverse coalition that we occupy in support of this legislation. So yes, short answer, yes, very involved.
Yes, and AFWA supports a coalition. We've got a number of calls. We work on legislative strategy together. We work on communication strategy. So yes, there is a robust effort out of AFWA along with our partner agencies. So there are plenty of conservation organizations at the national level who are beating the drum on the Hill. And it is a great coalition to work with. In fact, Caroline and I work really closely with the National Wildlife Federation. We typically will do a briefing every Congress to staffers to support this. And I anticipate that we would do that. And AFWA does lots of engagement on this. So yes.
And then our final question, will the 25% apportionment based on state population be using the newest 2020 census data?
That is a great question. It's probably going to depend on when this legislation is passed. Short answer, I would say likely, but all of that is, well, I don't know actually what the apportionments look like that Fish and Wildlife Service is putting out into the world right now, if that includes updated census information. But once we get to passage of the bill, implementation of the bill, and needed associated regulatory rules to implement the bill, that is when that decision would be made as far as most up-to-date population numbers. All right. Well, with that, I really want to thank everyone for joining us here today. As Drew stated, our partnership with the American Fisheries Society is strong and great, and Drew and I work great together. And I really hope if you all have the opportunity to coordinate at the state level, though not necessary, it would be of great benefit towards the grassroots engagement in support of this legislation. Any questions, please feel free to email us and we will get these resources out to you all shortly. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank y'all.